Hey, this is Mesodis from Whispered Fates. Before we begin, I want to make something clear. The story you're about to hear is entirely fictional. The characters and the events are not real, and any resemblance to real people or events is purely coincidental. Now, with that said, let's step into the story together.
The blue lights came on without warning. One moment, Edward and Linda Cole were cruising down a quiet two-lane road in Hargrove County, Virginia. Windows down, jazz playing soft on the radio. The kind of summer evening that makes a person feel like time has finally slowed down enough to breathe. The next moment, the world shrunk to a pair of flashing red and blue lights, filling the rearview mirror, and everything that had been peaceful turned sharp and still. Edward's hands went to 10 and 2 without thinking, not because he was nervous, not because he had done anything wrong, but because he had been black in America long enough to know that when those lights come on, you keep your hands where they can be seen, you keep your voice calm, and you pray the man walking toward your window is having a decent day. He wasn't. Before we get any further into this story, I want to hear from you. Drop a comment right now and tell me where you're watching from. Are you in Georgia, Texas, New York, California? Let me know. I read every single one. Now, let's go back to the beginning. Because what happened on that road in Hargrove County, Virginia, on a warm Tuesday evening in July, didn't start with those flashing lights. It started 37 years earlier, in a row house in Baltimore, Maryland, where a little boy named Edward James Cole decided, after watching his father get humiliated by a police officer for no reason other than the color of his skin, that he was going to spend his life making sure that what happened to his father could never happen to anybody else. He almost succeeded. Almost. Baltimore in the late 1960s was a city of contrasts so sharp they could cut you. There were neighborhoods of extraordinary beauty, tree-lined blocks where families had lived for generations, where grandmothers sat on front stoops in the evening, and men played cards on folding tables, and children ran through fire hydrant spray in the August heat. And then there were the other parts of Baltimore, the parts the newspapers wrote about, the parts the politicians pointed to when they needed a problem to solve without actually solving anything. The Cole family lived somewhere in between. James Cole Sr. worked at the Bethlehem steel plant at Sparrows Point. He was a big man, not loud, not flashy, just solid. The kind of man who showed up. He showed up for work at 5 in the morning and came home smelling of metal and effort. He showed up for his wife, Dorothy, who taught 3rd grade at Frederick Douglass Elementary. He showed up for his son, Edward, and his daughter, Renee, at every school play, every baseball game, every parent-teacher conference. James Cole Sr. was, by every honest measure, a good man. He was 41 years old when Officer Terrence Briggs pulled him over on a Wednesday afternoon in October 1971. Edward was 9 years old. He was in the back seat. James had picked Edward up from school early that day because Dorothy had a parent-teacher conference of her own to attend and couldn't make it. They were heading to the hardware store because James was fixing the back porch steps and needed lumber screws. That was it. That was the whole story. A father and his son going to the hardware store on a Wednesday afternoon. So Officer Briggs pulled them over 3 blocks from the hardware store. There was no reason. None that James could see anyway. He hadn't been speeding. His registration was current. His tags were valid. His lights worked. He had done nothing wrong. But Officer Briggs walked up to the driver's side window, with his hand already resting on his holster, his jaw already set, like a man who had decided something before he'd even gotten out of the patrol car. "License and registration," he said. Not, "Good afternoon," not "Sir." Just the flat, hard words of a man who saw James Cole not as a person, but as a problem. James handed over his license and registration without a word. Briggs looked at them like they might be counterfeit. He looked at James like he was deciding something, Then he said, "Step out of the vehicle." "Is there a problem?" "Officer?" James asked. "I said step out of the vehicle." James stepped out. He kept his hands visible. He kept his voice level. And for the next 22 minutes, on a public street in broad daylight, Officer Briggs questioned him, searched his car, finding nothing, because there was nothing to find, and spoke to him in a tone that Edward, sitting frozen in the back seat, had never heard anyone use with his father before. It was the tone you use with someone you don't consider fully human. Edward watched every second of it. He watched his father, the man who fixed the porch steps and smelled like metal and showed up for everything, stand there on a public sidewalk and absorb that tone without breaking, without raising his voice, without giving Briggs any excuse, because James Cole understood very well what an excuse might cost him. When it was finally over, when Briggs had handed back the license and registration with a look of contempt and driven away without apology or explanation, James got back in the car and sat for a moment with his hands on the steering wheel. Edward didn't say anything. He didn't know what to say. Then James turned around, looked at his son in the back seat, and said something that Edward Cole carried with him for the rest of his life. "That man is going to do that to somebody else tomorrow, and the day after that, and the day after that. The only way to stop men like that is to be in the room where the decisions get made. You understand me?" "Yes, sir," Edward said. "Don't just say yes. Understand me." "I understand you," Edward said. And he did. Edward Cole was not the kind of student who coasted. He was not blessed with the easy, effortless brilliance that some people have, the kind where things just click without much struggle. What Edward had was something different, and, in many ways, more powerful. He was relentless. He was the kind of student who stayed in the library until they turned the lights off, who asked the professor questions after class that the professor had to go home and think about, who read the case not once, but 4 times, looking for the seam, the crack, the argument that nobody else had found yet. He graduated from Frederick Douglass High School in 1980 as valedictorian. His speech that day was 3 minutes long, and he used every second of it to talk about his father. Not about his own achievements, about James Cole Sr., standing on that sidewalk in 1971, with his hands visible and his voice level, on absorbing something no man should have to absorb. "My father taught me that dignity is not given," Edward said at that podium. "It is maintained, and it is maintained even, especially, when the person standing in front of you is trying their hardest to take it away." He went to the University of Maryland on a full scholarship. Then he went to Howard University School of Law, where he graduated second in his class and was the editor of the Law Review. He clerked for a federal judge in the Fourth Circuit. He joined the U.S. Attorney's Office in Baltimore and spent 8 years prosecuting public corruption cases, the kind of cases that put elected officials and law enforcement officers in prison when they abused the power that had been given to them. He was very good at it. In 2001, he went into private practice. So he took on civil rights cases, police brutality cases, cases where the person on the wrong end of the blue lights had no resources, no connections, and no recourse. He won more than he lost, which in that field was saying something. In 2009, the President of the United States nominated Edward James Cole to serve as a United States federal judge for the Eastern District of Virginia. The Senate confirmed him 71-29. He was 56 years old when he was sworn in. His mother, Dorothy, who had retired from teaching 3rd grade and was now 74, was in the front row. His father, James Cole Sr., who had lived long enough to see this day, was in the wheelchair next to her. When the clerk administered the oath, Edward caught his father's eye. James gave him one slow nod, the kind of nod that carried 38 years of weight. No story about Edward Cole is complete without Linda. They had met at a bar association dinner in 1994, which sounds less romantic than it actually was, because it was Linda Reeves who had walked up to Edward Cole with 2 glasses of wine and said, without preamble, "You're the attorney who got that verdict in the Hargrove case last week, aren't you?" "I am," Edward said. "I read the brief," she said. "Your third-party liability argument in Section 4 was creative, but it had a hole in it." Edward looked at her. "Did it?" "It did. The precedent you cited from the 8th Circuit doesn't apply cleanly to Virginia fact patterns. You got lucky the defense didn't catch it." "I know they didn't catch it," Edward said. "I was counting on it." She laughed. He laughed. She handed him one of the glasses of wine, even though she had clearly brought both of them for herself. Linda Reeves had grown up in Richmond, Virginia. Her father was a surgeon. Her mother was an architect. She had gone to Georgetown undergrad, Columbia Law, and then come back to Virginia, because Virginia, she said, was where the interesting work was. She was a partner at Whitmore and Reeves, a firm she had co-founded at the age of 34, and she specialized in constitutional law with a particular focus on equal protection cases. She was, in short, exactly the kind of person Edward Cole had been looking for without knowing he was looking. They were married in 1997 in a small ceremony in Richmond. His parents came. Her parents came. His sister Renee was the maid of honor and cried through the entire ceremony, which she blamed on allergies, and nobody believed. And by the time Edward was appointed to the federal bench, Linda had argued 4 cases before the United States Supreme Court. She had won 3 of them. The 4th was a 5-4 loss that legal scholars still argued about in law review articles, and Linda herself had written a 40-page response in the Yale Law Journal that was widely considered to have gotten the better of the argument even in defeat. She was, to use the word precisely, formidable. She was also, on that Tuesday evening in July, wearing cream-colored slacks and a black blazer, and sitting in the passenger seat of their 2023 Mercedes E-Class with her reading glasses on her nose and a brief in her lap, because Linda Cole did not waste time, not even on a 2-hour drive through the Virginia countryside. Edward was driving. The jazz was playing. The evening was golden. Then the blue lights came on. Raymond Eugene Adams had been a police officer in Hargrove County for 29 years. He was not a complicated man. He would tell you so himself. He had, in fact, told his ex-wife so during the proceedings of their divorce in 2018, in a tone that suggested he considered this a virtue rather than a limitation. He liked things simple. He liked things the way they were. He liked Hargrove County the way it had been when he'd started on the force in 1995, when the county was smaller and quieter, and more, as Raymond would put it, careful with his language, familiar. What Raymond meant by familiar, if you pressed him, was whiter. He would never say so outright. Raymond Adams was not a man who used slurs. He was not a man who burned crosses or marched in parades or posted inflammatory things on the internet, though he had liked a few posts that a reasonable person might have found troubling. He was, in his own self-conception, a fair man, a law and order man, a man who treated everybody the same, except that he didn't. His colleagues knew it. His supervisors knew it, or at least suspected it, which came to the same thing, because suspecting something and doing nothing about it is its own kind of choice. There had been 3 complaints filed against Raymond Adams in his 29 years of service. All 3 had come from black motorists. All 3 had been investigated and dismissed. In each case, the investigating officer had been a colleague of Raymond's. In each case, Raymond had been cleared of any wrongdoing. Raymond Adams had never faced a consequence in his professional life. This had not made him a better man. On the evening of July 14th, Raymond was nearing the end of a double shift. He was tired. He was irritable. He had spent most of the afternoon dealing with a fender bender on Route 7 that had tied up traffic for 2 hours, while the 2 drivers, both white, both from the county, both people Raymond knew, exchanged insurance information and complained about the heat. He had eaten a bad sandwich from the gas station at mile marker 12. He was, in every measurable sense, in a bad mood. He was parked in a turnout on County Road 4 when the Mercedes came through. Dark silver. Virginia plates, moving at exactly the speed limit. He ran the plates, habit, and they came back clean. No warrants, no flags. He watched the car pass. He thought about the gas station sandwich. He thought about the end of his shift, still 2 hours away. But he thought about something that wasn't quite a thought, more of an instinct, or what he told himself was an instinct, though a less forgiving analysis would have called it something else. And he pulled out of the turnout and hit the lights. He didn't have a reason. He had a justification. He would come up with one in the next 30 seconds. Something about the car drifting slightly toward the shoulder. Something that would be vague enough to be unprovable and specific enough to sound official. Raymond Adams had had 29 years of practice at coming up with justifications. He hit the lights, and the Mercedes pulled over, and Raymond Adams got out of his patrol car and walked toward what he was quite sure was going to be a very routine stop. He had no idea what was about to happen to his life, and Edward saw the lights in the mirror and felt the familiar narrowing, the specific, precise reduction of the world that Black Americans of a certain generation know the way they know their own name. Not panic, not rage, just a careful, deliberate contraction of attention down to the task at hand. He signaled, even though there was nowhere particular to signal to, because signaling was correct, and correct was what you were in a moment like this. He pulled over smoothly. He put the car in park. He turned the music down to nothing. Linda looked up from her brief. She read the situation in a single glance. She was a lawyer. She read rooms for a living. And she took her reading glasses off and set them on the brief and set the brief on the floor and put her hands in her lap where they could be seen. When they had been married for 26 years, they had rehearsed none of this. They had rehearsed all of this. Insurance and registration are in the glove compartment, Edward said quietly. I know, Linda said. I'll get my wallet first. Show him everything before he asks. I know, Edward. Raymond Adams appeared at the driver's side window. He was a heavy-set man, somewhere in his late 50s, with a face that had once probably been square and strong, and had gone soft and red in the way that certain kinds of anger sometimes manifests over time. He had pale blue eyes that were sharp in a calculating way. He was not in uniform distress, not sweating, not wound up. He was entirely calm in the practiced manner of a man who had done this many times. License and registration, he said. No greeting. Buono. Good evening. No, sir. Edward recognized the tone immediately. He had spent his entire adult life, as an attorney, as a prosecutor, as a federal judge, working with and against and around men who used that tone. It was the tone of a man who had already decided something. Good evening, officer, Edward said. I'm going to reach into my jacket for my wallet. My wife is going to open the glove compartment for the insurance card and registration. Is that all right? Raymond looked at him for a moment with the blue eyes. Go ahead, he said. Edward produced his wallet. He held it up, clearly deliberately, before opening it and extracting his driver's license. He handed it through the window. Linda had the insurance card and registration ready. She handed them across to Edward, who handed them to Raymond. Raymond looked at the license. He looked at it the way Briggs had looked at James Cole Sr.'s license 40 years earlier, as though it might be a forgery. He looked at Edward. He looked back at the license. He looked at Linda. Where are you two headed tonight? He said. We're heading home, Edward said. We live about 30 miles up the road. Where are you coming from? Charlottesville. We had dinner with friends. Raymond said nothing for a moment. He was looking at the car, the interior, the back seat, the floor of the car. You been drinking tonight? I had half a glass of wine with dinner, approximately 3 hours ago, Edward said. My wife had a full glass. "Half a glass," Raymond repeated, with a very specific inflection that managed to imply skepticism without technically saying anything accusatory. "So that's correct. You mind if I ask you to step out of the vehicle for me?" There it was. Edward felt Linda go very still beside him. Not afraid. Linda Cole wasn't a woman who went afraid easily. Still, the way a person goes still when they are deciding something. "May I ask the reason for the stop, officer?" Edward said. His voice was level. His hands were still. Raymond's jaw tightened slightly. He was not accustomed to being asked that question. He had a justification ready. He had composed it on the way to the car, and he delivered it now. "Your vehicle crossed the center line back there by about 1.5 feet. Wanted to make sure you were okay to drive." "I appreciate your concern," Edward said. "I'll be happy to take a field sobriety test if you'd like to administer one." Raymond hadn't expected that. The offer to take the test was, in his experience, something only sober people made. It complicated things. "I'd like you to step out of the vehicle," Raymond said again. And here was the moment that Edward Cole had faced before in different forms throughout his life. The moment where the reasonable, prudent, legally defensible thing to do was exactly what Raymond Adams wanted him to do, and the cost of doing it was something that couldn't be measured in legal terms. Edward opened the door and stepped out. He was wearing a white linen suit. He was 6 feet 1 inch tall. He moved with the precise, deliberate calm of a man who had spent 30 years in courtrooms. He stood on the shoulder of County Road 4 in Hargrove County, Virginia, in the golden evening light. And he looked at Raymond Adams with an expression that was entirely professional and utterly without fear. Raymond Adams looked back at him. Something crossed Raymond's face, a flicker of something, and then it was gone, replaced by the practiced blankness of a man going through a procedure. "Sir, I'm going to ask you to walk a straight line for me." "Officer." Linda's voice came from inside the car, calm, precise, the voice of a woman who had argued before the Supreme Court. "Before you continue, I'd like to ask you for your name and badge number for my records." Raymond turned to look at her. She had gotten out of the car on the passenger side and was standing with her hands visible and a look on her face that Raymond, in all his years of experience, had never quite seen before. It was the look of someone who was not intimidated, but had no intention of becoming intimidated, and was, in fact, already 4 moves ahead of him on a board he hadn't realized they were playing on. "Ma'am, I need you to stay in the vehicle." "I'm not required to stay in the vehicle, officer. I'm a passenger, and I'm not being detained. I have the right to stand outside the vehicle. I'd like your name and badge number, please." Raymond stared at her. "Officer Raymond Adams," he said after a moment. "Badge number 447. "Thank you," Linda said. She had her phone out. She was recording. Raymond's eyes went to the phone, then back to Edward. Then something in him that had been operating on automatic shifted into a different gear, a more combative one. "Sir, you want to put your hands on the hood of the vehicle for me?" "Am I being detained, Officer Adams?" Edward said. I'm asking you to cooperate with a lawful investigation." "I'm cooperating fully. I've provided my license, registration, and insurance. I've offered to take a field sobriety test. I'm standing here calmly with my hands at my sides. I'd like to know specifically whether I am being detained." Raymond Adams took a step forward. "Sir, I'm going to need you to watch your tone." "Officer Adams." Edward's voice was still level, still professional, still entirely without the heat that Raymond was used to provoking. "My tone has been courteous throughout this interaction. I'm going to ask you one more time whether I am being detained or whether I'm free to go." Raymond pointed his finger. Now that photograph, the one that Linda Cole's phone had been capturing since the moment she stepped out of the car, showed Raymond Adams pointing his finger 2 inches from Edward Cole's face. It showed Edward Cole standing absolutely still, his expression not defiant, not afraid, just steadily, implacably present. It showed Linda Cole in the background, phone raised, recording. That photograph would be in every newspaper in the state of Virginia within 36 hours. But that came later. First, Raymond Adams said, "I don't know who you think you are." "My name is Edward Cole," Edward said. "I am a United States federal judge for the Eastern District of Virginia. I have been a federal judge for 15 years. Before that, I was an assistant U.S. attorney for 8 years. I've been licensed to practice law in the state of Virginia for 37 years. I tell you this not to intimidate you, Officer Adams, but because I want to make sure you have complete information." The silence that followed was a specific kind of silence. It was not the silence of nothing happening. It was the silence of many things happening very quickly inside one man's head. Raymond Adams' finger was still extended. Then, slowly, it lowered. He looked at Edward Cole. He looked at the white linen suit, the watchful, steady eyes, the absolute absence of any of the reactions he was accustomed to provoking. He looked at Linda Cole, standing 10 feet away with her phone recording everything. And Raymond Adams, 29-year veteran of the Hargrove County Sheriff's Department, understood, in a way that went beyond the professional and hit something closer to the bone, that he had made a very serious mistake. He gave Edward back the license, registration, and insurance card without a word. He said, "You're free to go." Flat. Terse, without apology. Edward took the documents. He said, "Thank you, Officer Adams." Same tone he'd used throughout, same professional courtesy. Not triumph in it, not contempt. Just the voice of a man who had never needed Raymond Adams' validation and had never expected to receive it. They got back in the car. Edward put the car in drive and pulled back onto County Road 4, and Raymond Adams watched the dark silver Mercedes pull away until its taillights disappeared around a long curve in the road. Then Raymond got back in his patrol car and sat for a moment. He told himself it had been fine. He told himself it had been a routine stop, and the man had been mouthy and uncooperative, and he'd handled it professionally. He told himself that a federal judge wasn't a special category, that the law applied to everyone equally, and he had been enforcing the law. He believed this, or told himself he believed it, for approximately 2 hours. Then his phone rang. It was his shift supervisor, Captain Derek Holloway. "Raymond," said Captain Holloway, in a voice that Raymond had never heard the captain use before. "I need you to come in." Linda had called her colleague Janet Okafor before they'd even gotten back on the highway. Janet was a civil rights attorney at the ACLU of Virginia. They had known each other for 20 years. Linda described the stop calmly and precisely, and the way she described everything, dates, times, the exact words used, the specific sequence of events. She had the video on her phone. She had Raymond Adams' name and badge number. "I'll have calls out within the hour," Janet said. "I want to be thoughtful about this," Linda said. "This needs to be handled correctly." "Linda," he pointed his finger in Edward's face. He tried to have Edward put his hands on the hood of the car. On what basis? On the basis of none. "Send me the video." Linda sent the video. She also called their daughter, Camille, who was 31 years old and worked as a journalist for the Washington Post. And she called Camille not to weaponize her position at the Post. Linda Cole had not survived 30 years in constitutional law by being careless about conflicts of interest, but because Camille was her daughter, and Linda believed in keeping her family informed. Camille, for her part, told her editor about the call before she told anyone else. Her editor, a 20-year veteran named Marion Walsh, listened carefully, and then said, "Are you going to recuse yourself from this one?" "I already have," Camille said. Marion Walsh assigned 2 other reporters to the story by 9 o'clock that evening. Edward drove the rest of the way home without saying much. This was not unusual for Edward. He was a man who processed things internally before he spoke about them, as a habit that had served him well on the bench and occasionally driven Linda to gentle distraction in their marriage. When they got home, he changed out of the white linen suit and sat in his study for a while. Linda brought him a glass of water and sat across from him and waited, because she knew him well enough to know that he was not yet done thinking. "You know what he reminded me of," Edward said finally. "Tell me," Linda said. "Briggs," he said. "Terrence Briggs, the officer who pulled my father over in 1971. Linda was quiet for a moment. "Same tone," Edward said. 50 years. Same tone. "I know. That's what gets me," Edward said. "Not what he did to me. What he did to me barely touched me, Linda. I've been a federal judge for 15 years. I've been a lawyer for 37 years. I had documentation of everything before we'd been pulled over for 60 seconds. He paused. "But he does this. He's been doing this. For how long? Who does it to, when it isn't a federal judge? When it's someone who doesn't have the documentation, doesn't know the exact words to say, doesn't have a spouse with a phone and 30 years of civil rights law?" Linda said, "That's what we're going to find out." The video was on the internet by 6 o'clock the next morning. Camille Cole had recused herself, but the two reporters Mary and Walsh assigned to the story were excellent at their jobs. By 5:45 a.m., they had verified the video's authenticity, confirmed through public records that Edward Cole was indeed a sitting federal judge in the Eastern District of Virginia, and confirmed that Raymond Adams was indeed a deputy in the Hargrove County Sheriff's Department, and published a story that was, in the careful language of experienced journalists, devastating. The headline read, "Federal Judge Says He Was Racially Profiled During Traffic Stop in Hargrove County." By 8 in the morning, it had been shared 90,000 times. By noon, it had been shared 400,000 times, and was the top story on 3 major cable news networks. Sheriff Patrick Greer of Hargrove County issued a statement at 10 a.m. saying that the department took all allegations of misconduct seriously and that an internal investigation had been opened. The statement was careful and measured and gave absolutely nothing away. Now, Captain Derek Holloway had already placed Raymond Adams on administrative leave pending the outcome of the investigation. Raymond, for his part, issued his own statement through a union representative, which said that he had conducted a routine traffic stop based on an observed traffic violation and had behaved professionally throughout the interaction. The statement did not address the finger-pointing. It did not address the fact that no citation had been issued. It did not address the 29-year pattern, because there was a pattern. And once the story broke, the pattern found its voice. Within 48 hours of the story's publication, 11 people had come forward. 11 people who had been stopped by Raymond Adams over the course of his 29-year career. 10 of them were black. 1 was Latino. To all 11 described the same stop, the same flat tone, the same pointed finger, the same baseless demand to step out of the vehicle, the same search that found nothing, the same dismissal without apology or explanation. One of them was a 64-year-old retired schoolteacher named Henrietta Morse, who had been pulled over by Raymond Adams in 2016 on her way home from church. She had been wearing her Sunday dress. She had done nothing wrong. Raymond Adams had kept her on the shoulder of the road for 40 minutes while he searched her car and called for backup that turned out not to be necessary. She had filed a complaint. It had been dismissed. "I cried all the way home," she told the reporters. "Not because I was scared. I was past scared by then. I cried because I thought, this is my county. I've lived here for 40 years. I taught children here, and this man made me feel like I was a criminal for driving home from church." One of them was a 23-year-old college student named Marcus Webb, who had been pulled over by Adams on his way back to campus after Thanksgiving break in 2022. Marcus had no criminal record. He had been driving the speed limit. Adams had made him stand outside in the November cold for 30 minutes, had searched his car, had questioned him about his travel plans with an intensity Marcus described as interrogation style. No citation, no apology. "I called my mom from the parking lot when I got back to campus," Marcus said. "I was shaking, not from the cold." One of them, and this one sent a particular shock through the community, was James Whitfield, a 57-year-old man who had been stopped by Adams in 2019. Now, James Whitfield had subsequently been wrongly arrested after Adams claimed he had found contraband in his vehicle that Whitfield maintained had been planted. The charges had been dropped after 8 months when the evidence chain was found to have irregularities. James Whitfield had lost his job during those 8 months. He had lost his apartment. He had nearly lost custody of his youngest son. He had filed a complaint. It had been dismissed. He had been trying, without success, to find an attorney willing to take his case on contingency for 2 years. Janet Okafor at the ACLU of Virginia called James Whitfield within 24 hours of the story breaking and offered to take his case. It was 3 weeks later when things came to a head. The Hargrove County Sheriff's Department had concluded its internal investigation. Sheriff Greer had called a press conference for 2 p.m. on a Thursday afternoon. The press conference was going to be, sources told multiple reporters, significant. Edward Cole was not present at the press conference. He had recused himself from any judicial proceedings in Hargrove County that might be related to Raymond Adams. This was the legally required and ethically correct thing to do, and Edward Cole had done legally required and ethically correct things his entire life. But he watched it on television, in his chambers, with the door closed and the sound turned low. Sheriff Patrick Greer was a heavy-set man in his early 60s, with white hair and the cautious, careful manner of a politician who had spent 3 decades navigating a county that was, in his private assessment, changing faster than its residents quite understood. He had been sheriff for 14 years. He had hired Raymond Adams. He had supervised Raymond Adams. He had received, reviewed, and dismissed 3 complaints about Raymond Adams. He stood at the podium in the county building's main conference room with the Hargrove County seal behind him and 37 reporters in front of him, and he read from a prepared statement. The investigation had found that Deputy Raymond Adams had conducted multiple traffic stops of minority motorists over the course of his career that lacked documented probable cause or reasonable suspicion. The investigation had found that Deputy Adams's behavior during the stop of Judge Edward Cole on July 14th was inconsistent with department standards and training. The investigation had found no evidence that the 3 previous complaints against Deputy Adams had been given adequate consideration during the review process. Sheriff Greer announced that Raymond Adams had been terminated from the Hargrove County Sheriff's Department, effective immediately. He announced that the department was implementing new mandatory training on implicit bias and traffic stop procedures. He announced that the department was establishing an independent civilian review board for complaints of officer misconduct. And then, this was the part that made the cameras flash. He said something that wasn't in the prepared statement, and something that he had evidently decided in the hours before the press conference that he needed to say regardless of whether the lawyers had approved it. "I want to address this directly," Sheriff Greer said, and something in his voice changed, became less managed, less prepared. Raymond Adams' behavior toward Judge Cole was wrong. It was wrong in every sense of that word. But I want to say, and I need to say, that the people who came forward in the past 3 weeks deserve to be acknowledged. 11 people. 11 people over 29 years. And the question that I have had to sit with, that this department has had to sit with, is why it took a federal judge for us to listen. He paused. That question doesn't have a comfortable answer. I'm not going to stand here and pretend it does. And what I can tell you is that this department is going to operate differently going forward. And I can tell you that James Whitfield Henrietta Morse, Marcus Webb, and the 8 other individuals who came forward deserve apologies that this department should have offered years ago. He looked directly into the cameras. "I'm sorry," he said, "to all of them, on behalf of this department. What happened to them was wrong, and they deserved better." It was not enough. Linda Cole would tell you so herself. One press conference did not undo 29 years. One termination did not address the structural failures that had allowed Raymond Adams to operate with impunity for 3 decades. One apology from a sheriff did not return James Whitfield his job, his apartment, the 8 months he had spent under false charges, or the fear that had lived in his youngest son's eyes during those 8 months. But it was something. In a world where the powerful often absorbed accountability the way limestone absorbs water, slowly, without visible impact, it was something. Of all the stories that emerged from those 3 weeks, it was James Whitfield's that stayed with Edward Cole the longest. James was 57 years old. He had grown up in Hargrove County, one of 7 children of a man who had worked on a dairy farm and a woman who had cleaned houses. He had graduated from the county high school in 1986. He had worked for 22 years at a packaging plant on the county's eastern border, reliable, steady work that he'd been good at, and that had given him a stable life. He had a daughter and a son, both grown. He had a grandson named Theo, who was 4 years old, and whose photograph he kept in his wallet. He had been stopped by Raymond Adams on a Saturday afternoon in March 2019. He had been coming home from the hardware store, the same errand, Edward noted, that his father had been on when Briggs pulled him over in 1971. The circularity of this struck him as something that he couldn't quite put into words. Adams had claimed he'd seen James fail to make a complete stop at a stop sign. James maintained he had stopped completely. This was the kind of claim, vague, unverifiable, the officer's word against the drivers, that had formed the factual basis of countless unjust stops over countless years. But this one went further than a stop. Adams had conducted a search of James's vehicle. He had claimed, subsequently, that he found a small quantity of a controlled substance in the wheel well of the trunk. James maintained, then, during his arrest, during his 8 months in legal limbo, and now, 3 weeks after the story broke, that he had never seen that substance before in his life. The charges had been dropped, not because Adams was found to have lied, that was never formally established, but because the evidence chain had irregularities that a careful defense attorney had found after 6 months of looking. The irregularities were technical. They were, in legal terms, sufficient. But they did not constitute a formal finding that Adams had planted evidence. James Whitfield was, therefore, and in the peculiar position of a man who had been exonerated without being declared innocent, a position that American law creates with disturbing regularity, and that the American public understands only dimly, if at all. When Janet Okafor took his case, she filed a civil suit against Raymond Adams and the Hargrove County Sheriff's Department, alleging malicious prosecution, false arrest, and violation of James Whitfield's civil rights under the 4th and 14th Amendments to the United States Constitution. The case would take time. These cases always took time. But Janet Okafor was very good at her job, and the story was now very public, and James Whitfield had, for the first time in 3 years, and something he had not allowed himself to feel during the 8 months of false charges and the 3 years of fruitless searching for an attorney. He had hope. Edward Cole met James Whitfield in person for the first time at a community meeting in Hargrove County in late August, 6 weeks after the traffic stop. Edward had requested a leave of absence from his judicial duties for the purpose of attending the meeting in a private capacity. The chief judge of the circuit had approved the request without hesitation. The meeting was held in the gymnasium of a community center on the county's south side. Folding chairs had been set up in rows. There were perhaps 300 people there. Black families, Latino families, at a number of white families who had come because they lived in the county and believed that what happened in their county was their business. Several of the 11 people who had come forward were there. Henrietta Morse was there in a blue dress with a string of pearls. Marcus Webb was there with his mother. James Whitfield was there with his grandson Theo, who was 4 years old and had fallen asleep across 2 folding chairs by the time the meeting was an hour old. Edward did not speak at the meeting in any official capacity. He was there, he had said publicly, to listen. And he did listen. For 3.5 hours, he listened to his neighbors, and the neighbors of his neighbors, describe what it was like to live in a county where a man like Raymond Adams had operated for 29 years, where 3 complaints had been filed and dismissed, where the system that was supposed to catch these things had not caught them, and the only reason the catching was happening now was because the person in the car had happened to be a federal judge. Near the end of the meeting, a woman near the back raised her hand. She was perhaps 70 years old. She had gray hair and wore a floral dress and reading glasses on a chain around her neck. Her name, Edward would learn later, was Estelle Freeman, and she had lived in Hargrove County for 51 years. "I want to ask Judge Cole something," she said, "if that's all right." Edward looked at the moderator, who nodded. "Go ahead, ma'am," Edward said. "I want to ask you," Estelle said, "what your father would say about all this, if he could see it." The gymnasium was quiet. Edward thought about his father, about James Cole Sr., who was 91 years old now and lived in a care facility in Baltimore, where Dorothy visited him every Tuesday and Saturday and read to him from the newspaper and held his hand. James Cole Sr., who no longer always remembered where he was or what year it was, but who sometimes, on good days, still recognized his son's voice on the phone and called him Eddie, the way he had when Edward was 9 years old and sitting in the back seat of a car watching a police officer speak to his father in a tone that no man should have to absorb. "My father," Edward said finally, "would say that we're not done." Estelle Freeman nodded slowly. "He'd also say, and this is something he told me when I was 9 years old, in circumstances that some of you might recognize, that the only way to stop men like Raymond Adams is to be in the room where the decisions get made." He paused. "I've been in that room for a long time. I intend to stay there, and I think we need more people in that room, a lot more." The gymnasium was still for another moment. Then Estelle Freeman said, "Well then, I suppose we know what to do." Raymond Adams did not attend the press conference. He was at home, on the couch, with the television off. He had been served with the civil complaint from Janet Okafor's office 2 days after the press conference. He had read it, or tried to read it, but the legal language had blurred, and he'd set it down and made himself a cup of coffee and then forgotten to drink the coffee. He had called his brother, Dennis, who lived in Richmond, because Dennis was the person Raymond called when he didn't know what else to do. Dennis was 61, retired from the Navy, a careful man with a straight-backed posture and a habit of listening completely before he said anything. Raymond told Dennis what had happened. All of it. The stop, the federal judge, the video, the termination, the 11 people. Dennis listened without interrupting. When Raymond was done, Dennis was quiet for a long time. "Ray," he said finally. "Yeah. Do you know why you pulled that car over?" Raymond started to say something about the center line, about the standard procedure, about the routine. "Ray," Dennis said again, "I'm not asking what you told the investigation. I'm asking if you know why you actually did it." A long silence. "I don't know," Raymond said. "I don't—" He stopped. "Oi, I thought I was—" "What did you think?" Raymond put his hand over his eyes. He was 61 years old. He had spent 61 years being certain about certain things, and sitting in his living room on a Wednesday afternoon, with a cold cup of coffee on the table beside him, he found that the certainty had gone somewhere. He couldn't find it. "I thought I was doing my job," he said finally. "Whose job?" Dennis said. Raymond didn't answer. Dennis said, "I've watched you for 29 years, Ray. I've watched you do things that I didn't say anything about because you were my brother, and I told myself I didn't know for sure. But I did know, and I didn't say anything." He paused. "That's on me, too. You understand? That's on me, too." They were quiet for a while. "That man," Raymond said. "Cole. What about him? He never got upset. Not once. I was standing there pointing at him and he just..." Raymond shook his head. "He just looked at me. What did that feel like?" Raymond thought about it. "Like he could see through me," he said. "Like he already knew exactly what I was." Dennis didn't say anything. "I don't know how to fix this," Raymond said. "I don't think you can fix it," Dennis said. "But you could start by being honest about what it was." Raymond looked at the cold cup of coffee. "I don't know if I'm ready for that," he said. "I know," Dennis said. "But Ray, you've got to get ready. Because those 11 people have been waiting a long time." 2 months after the stop on County Road 4, Raymond Adams sent a letter. Not to the press, not to the ACLU, not to the Hargrove County Sheriff's Department, or its lawyer, or his union representative. To Edward Cole, it was handwritten. 3 pages, front and back, in the cramped, careful handwriting of a man who had not written anything by hand, more significant than a grocery list in many years. Edward's law clerk received it in the Daily Mail and flagged it and brought it to Edward's attention, and Edward read it alone in his chambers with the door closed. He read it twice. The letter did not ask for forgiveness. It was careful about that, almost lawyerly in the way it avoided making demands on the person who had been wronged. What it did instead was explain, not justify. Raymond Adams was, in the letter, scrupulous about the distinction. He explained where the tone had come from. He explained the 29 years. He explained, with a painful and unvarnished honesty that Edward had not expected, the specific moment on the shoulder of County Road. For when he had looked at Edward Cole and understood not intellectually, but in some deeper, less comfortable way, that what he had always told himself about fairness and law and doing his job was a story, and the 11 people whose lives he had touched with that story did not have the luxury of believing it. He wrote about James Whitfield. He wrote about Henrietta Morse. He wrote about Marcus Webb. He called them by name. He said he had been reading about their experiences in the newspapers, and he had not been able to sleep. He wrote, near the end, "I don't expect anything from this letter. I don't expect you to respond, or to think better of me, or to use it in any way. I just needed to put these words somewhere outside my own head. I'm 61 years old, and I've spent 29 years being wrong about something I was absolutely certain I was right about. And I think the least I can do is say so plainly, even if only to you." Edward read the letter twice. Then he set it on his desk and looked out the window at the courthouse square below, where 2 pigeons were disputing a piece of bread crust with the focused intensity of experienced litigants. He did not respond immediately. He thought about it for 3 days. On the 4th day, he wrote a single paragraph back. "Mr. Adams, I received your letter. I have read it carefully. I believe it is honest, and I respect the difficulty of that honesty. What you did on July 14th was wrong. What you did to James Whitfield, Henrietta Morse, Marcus Webb, and the others was wrong in ways that your letter cannot undo and that your honesty cannot repair. But I have spent my entire professional life in a system premised on the belief that people are capable of understanding the nature of what they've done. And, in understanding it, changing. I don't know if that's true for you. Only time will show that. What I do know is that honest accounting is where change begins, if it begins at all. I wish you whatever clarity is necessary to do what comes next correctly. Cole. His father called on a Tuesday. This was unusual. His father, at 91, rarely called. It was more often Edward who called him, or Dorothy, who held the phone while James listened, or Renee, who drove down from Philadelphia to sit with him on weekends. But on a Tuesday in September, 2 months after County Road 4, the phone in Edward's chambers rang with his parents' number. He picked it up. "Eddie," said his father's voice. "Dad," Edward said. He could hear immediately that it was a good day. The voice was clear, present. "I've been watching the television," James Cole said. "Dorothy keeps telling me not to watch the news, but I watch the news." "I know you did, Dad." "That officer," James said. "What was his name?" "Adams. Raymond Adams." "Adams." A pause. "You know what I thought about when I saw it on the television." "Tell me." "Briggs," James said. "Terrence Briggs, October 1971. "I know," Edward said. "I thought about him too." "You were in the back seat," James said. "You were 9 years old. I looked back at you and I thought, what does this boy see right now? What does he take away from this?" A pause. "I was afraid of what you'd take away from it." "You told me to be in the room where the decisions get made," Edward said. "I did." "I was in the room, Dad." A long silence, the kind of silence that carries decades of specific weight. "I know you were, Eddie," James Cole said. "I know you were." The civil suit filed by Janet Okafor on behalf of James Whitfield was settled 18 months later. The terms were confidential, but sources familiar with the case indicated that James Whitfield received a substantial settlement and that the county agreed to fund an independent review of all cases involving Raymond Adams over the preceding 20 years. Marcus Webb finished his senior year of college and was accepted to law school. He said publicly that the experience had changed his professional direction entirely. He had planned to study business law, and now he planned to study civil rights law. Henrietta Morse gave the invocation at the Hargrove County Community Center's annual Founders' Day dinner in November. She wore the same blue dress with the string of pearls. Raymond Adams did not return to law enforcement. He took a job at his brother Dennis's contracting company in Richmond, doing inventory and logistics work. He attended a program at a local church focused on confronting racial bias, which he had found through his own research, and joined voluntarily. Whether this represented genuine transformation or the performance of penance, it was too early to say. The honest answer was that it would take years to know. The Sheriff Patrick Greer implemented the civilian review board he had promised. The first board was composed of 7 people, 4 of whom were members of the county's minority communities. It was imperfect. It was incomplete. It was a beginning. Edward Cole returned to the bench. He sat in his courtroom in the Eastern District of Virginia, and he did what he had been doing for 15 years, reading the law with care and applying it with precision and trying, with every decision, to build a world slightly closer to the one his father had told him to work toward on an October afternoon in 1971. With the smell of engine oil in the air and the hardware store 3 blocks away, and a police officer's retreating back, the only view through the windshield. Be in the room where the decisions get made. Edward Cole was in that room, and he intended to stay. And Linda Cole, who had stood on the shoulder of County Road 4 with her phone recording and her reading glasses in her pocket, and 30 years of constitutional law in her hands, Linda Cole drove to Charlottesville the following week for a speaking engagement at the University of Virginia School of Law. Her topic was the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. Specifically, she talked about what it was intended to mean, what it had meant in practice over 150 years, and what it needed to mean now. She talked for 90 minutes. When she was done, the students sat for a moment before applauding. Not politely, but with the specific energy of people who have just heard something that they know they'll be turning over in their minds for a long time. A first-year student raised her hand. "Mrs. Cole," she said, "what keeps you going? After everything you've seen, after what happened this summer, after 30 years of this, what keeps you going?" Linda thought about it. 11 people, she said. Henrietta Morse, Marcus Webb, James Whitfield, and 8 others. They kept going. They filed complaints, and the complaints were dismissed, and they kept going. They kept living their lives in their county, raising their children in their county, going to church, and going to work, and going to the hardware store. All of it in a place that had not protected them the way it should have. She paused. "If they can keep going," Linda said, "I think the least I can do is keep arguing."